other interpretations, such as being goal-oriented. So I think babies very quickly learn about goal-oriented behavior in humans because they see it around them a lot. And a human helping the, whatever it is, go up the hill to reach its goal will be something that has a positive value than something that's hindering the goal interpretation. So I agree with Paul that morality develops early, that good and bad develops early. I just would always look for a somewhat less rich interpretation when the baby is very young.
So they might think that person might be nicer to me.
Not even thinking like that, because I'm not even sure at 3 months you can have that kind of thinking, but that this person is contributing to the goal-oriented thing of getting to the top of the hill, and the other one is hindering it, so this one has positive valence, if you like.
Maybe that's right, Paul. We shouldn't read too much into what very tiny babies appear to be doing.
I think that these are, as psychologists like to say, empirical questions. So we have some scenarios that don't involve goals at all. So, for instance, babies don't like when somebody hits another person. And when somebody strokes or soothes another person, babies respond positively to it. Babies respond differently to goal completions of the sort I'm talking about in ways that seem, at least by around the age of 9 months, that are sort of rather distinctively moral because they relate them to reward and punishment.
Yeah, I would
And
agree.
also,
by 9 months, that's fine.
I guess that's the thing, isn't it? If you're talking about 3 months, it may be one thing. 9 months, we're already, if you think about 9-month-olds, we know, yes, there's a little person in there, and it's perfectly credible that they would react in that way.
Can relate to being punished, being stroked, and so forth, because they've experienced it and represented it themselves. I'm not disagreeing with Paul. I'm saying that we need to look always for how could this have its roots in something simpler, rather than building in something very elaborate from very early on.
But at the same time, and I agree with that, but we need to look always at questions of evolution and questions of other species. So the idea that there's be a hardwired morality isn't some sort of bizarre thing that one would make up. It rather sort of follows from standard Darwinian theory. Why are humans such social creatures? How could we sustain communities? And Darwin and a lot of biologists have said, since then have said, because in order to do so, we have to have some instinct to helping others, some instinct to punish people who free ride. Now what we don't get is
individual differences, Paul.
In the studies we look at, we don't get gender differences. We don't get differences depending on number of siblings. Now, other studies, which I'm very interested in, which you haven't talked about, involving the baby's own responses, empathetic responses, compassion, and so on, do find individual differences. Some of them aren't so surprising. Girls, for instance, show more pain at the suffering of others than boys, and they're somewhat more willing to help and caress people when they're in pain. And this fits the finding we find in adults.
This is The Forum from the BBC. Today, the developing child through the prism of literature and psychology and education. But now, time for our 60-second idea to change the world. And this week it's from neuroscientist Annette Karmiloff-Smith. And Annette, you've got just 60 seconds to make your case to me, Bridget Kendall, and my other two guests, psychologist Paul Bloom and writer Leslie Beak. So, Annette, if you've collected your thoughts, off you go.
I have an idea which might help tackle the problem of childhood obesity. I believe it's quite naive to think that we can change what families eat, so we need to target how they eat. And to make my point, I'll start with a very controversial statement. Eating a hamburger and chips slowly and chewing each mouthful fully before swallowing might be better for children than guzzling down an apple. My thinking stems from watching adults eating in restaurants. The overweight ones never put their cutlery down between bites and barely seem to chew before swallowing. But they're adults with a long history of eating too fast. So how do we target children? I think the government's plans to surmount childhood obesity are far too late in secondary school children. We need to begin soon after babies start on solids. So I target pregnant mums and then the nursery school teachers that have their children later. I train the mums to feed their babies very slowly and to give the baby always time to chew. And in nursery schools, I train the teachers to have young children put down their cutlery after each mouthful and chew 20 times before swallowing.
That's a great idea. From now on, I will consciously make an effort to put down my knife and fork between bites. But there's quite a following already, isn't there, for the slow food movement as an antidote to fast food. I think it was invented by an Italian. That's as much about being in touch with food producers as it is eating slowly. But you're talking much more about training babies.
Yeah, really young children.
So this is about training the young, malleable brain to want to chew slowly,
Yes,
is it?
I think if you start late, you've got a history of chewing fast. It's very hard to break it. But I'd have like chew charts where you get a star every time you chew for 20 counts before you swallow. You might have little competitions amongst the family or in the nursery school to see who can chew for the longest before swallowing. I think what it does is give children a real sense of taste of different foods. It also prepares the stomach far more for digestion. And I think it could take on over the long term to become a real habit for life. And that's what I'd like to see.
I was intrigued that you included pregnant mothers. Is this because you want to instill the habit in them, or do you think it could really affect the attitude of the fetus in the womb?
No, I don't think it'll affect the fetus, but I think if you get the pregnant mother to think ahead of time of how she's going to deal with solids when she has her baby, it's a good preparation.
Leslie Beak, what do you think about this?
Well, I think it's a very good idea, actually. I think we all need to slow down in practically everything that we do.
Mm-hmm.
And eating slowly is, in this day and age, probably a good thing. But previously, we didn't tend to eat all the time and eat slowly or fast. We ate a lot at one go and then not much in between. So I don't know what the link is between that study and early behaviour in human beings. I don't know if we do know that, but
it's not
it
a
strikes
study.
me that there might.
It's an idea that came to my head when I was asked for a 60-second bite.
Right.
I just think that if you watch the way people eat nowadays, they're in a hurry. And in the past, we used to sit down to family meals. Everything took much longer. And we really do have a serious problem of childhood obesity. So this was just one idea as to how to tackle it.
Paul Bloom, what's your thought? Because if I remember rightly, it used to be the part of nursery training, didn't it, in years gone by, to eat your food slowly and not to gobble. But it clearly didn't work, because here we all are, eating fast food. So do you think it would work, Paul?
No, but I think Annette has got a perfect diagnosis of the problem. My skepticism about the solution is that it relies on self-control. And self-control is something which is in short supply, particularly for babies and young children. But riffing off Annette, I want to sort of offer a technological alternative.
Okay.
Which is, what if we create cutlery, forks and spoons, that are designed that you have to use them slowly? So imagine a
clever.
fork or spoon that is rigid, but if you move it too quickly, like that's right. So my own experience is, living in China, I ate a lot less because I couldn't use chopsticks so well, so it slowed me down. So we set it up so that say a fork would become limp and useless if it didn't have a 10-second pause.
Oh, I
between
like
being
that very
used
much.
last time. And Annette and I will patent this together and we'll change the world. Get
Okay,
ready.
smart knives and forks to teach us to
That's
eat
right.
slowly. Thanks. And if you're listening and you have anything to add, don't forget, we're continuing the conversation on Facebook, on Twitter. You'll find all the details on our website. Now, so far we've been talking about the mental development of babies, but Leslie Beak, you engage with an audience which is a bit older because you're a writer of books for children and teenagers. You're based in South Africa, and all of the 80 or so books that you've published focus on African stories and imagery. And what's really interesting is that I gather that a number of them are aimed at children who have English not as their first or second language, but even their third or fourth language. How does that influence the way you write?
It influences it completely. You have to think about every word that you use, and it's similar in a way to the way picture books are constructed, where maybe there's no words, but the ideas have to be very clear and very, not obvious, but very apparent to the child reader or through the person who's reading to the child. So you have to choose your words extremely carefully. And that doesn't mean that you can't use beautiful words. I think one of the problems that we have is that children don't hear enough beautiful language. They hear a lot of language being used in situations which are not challenging in the way of great literature, for example. They hear what people are saying, and I mentioned soap operas already, but I think it's an indication of level of concentration and understanding. It's an easy thing to do, to come home from school, switch on, but switch your brain off and just watch other people doing something. And I think television has a place, because I work a lot with children who would not normally speak much English, but they understand quite a lot. They won't write it and they can't really speak it, but they understand a lot of what you're saying. And I give the credit for that to television, actually, because they watch a lot of people, listen to a lot of people speaking English. So in multi-language situations, it does help a lot. We always have translators in case there's a difficulty with a word. But if you've pitched your text correctly, and it should be high interest for that age group, and low reading ability or easy reading ability for that age group, so that you can put the ideas together with the words and not lose them because you've got a story that's too simple for them. They have to be challenged.
It's interesting that you mentioned pictures, because it's right, isn't it, Annette, that you, in a child's development, you begin to grasp images before you start to understand language, verbal language.
Oh, I think both
right?
go together,
You think
really.
they go together?
Yes, I think children have quite early understanding of language way before they start to produce it. But I'd like to go back to Leslie's point about television, actually, because I think it's an interesting issue that is a very important one today. One of the tricks I have for whether or not a TV program is good for children is to stand behind the TV and see whether the child's eyes are absolutely fixated in the middle and not moving at all, or whether the child is darting around across the screen and really showing understanding. And I think any program that really makes the child an active participant rather than a passive observer is a good one, and can accompany books and be just as useful as books.
Leslie.
It's interesting because the Sesame Street team, when they piloted the programs,
This is a children's
used something-
program from the US, puppets and so on.
Yes,
Yeah.
they used something called a distractometer, I think it was called, but it was a device where children would watch an edition of Sesame Street and something else would be going on the left or right of their field of vision, and then they could measure. I don't want to stand on anyone's toes here, I don't know anything about measuring, but they could then see where the children were looking and say, all right, this episode isn't working, because they're looking at the distractometer more than they're looking at the televised episode. So I think it's very, very interesting to make those links between how television interacts with children or not. And if they're just sitting staring at a lighted square, they're not doing anything.
I agree.
They have to interact.
I have to say the people who create television programs for kids are geniuses at exploiting the cognitive, the mental system of children. I lived in London for a year, and my son Max was 2 years old, and he was entranced by the Teletubbies. Mm-hmm. And he would sit, fixed on them, and I would watch, and I think this is boring, ridiculous, insane, but it had this hypnotic quality on him, and I just have to, I'm not sure it's a moral activity that these people are doing, but they're geniuses at hitting the buttons in the minds of the young children and babies.
I'm intrigued by the consensus around the table that when a child stares intently, that this is not a good thing for it to be doing, that it ought to be engaging in a broader way. Because coming back to your profession, Leslie, of storytelling, if you gather children round to hear a story, actually you want them to focus intently on the storyteller, don't you? And be transported into the world they're in. And that, in a way, is a type of hypnosis and mesmerising. So why is that all right with the storyteller but not all right with the television?
I think it's the quantity that makes the difference. Storytelling is becoming rarer, even in traditional cultures. It's becoming rarer for children to actually do that, to sit down and listen to a story. And they don't then learn the process of going on to reading a story for themselves. So it's something that happens now and again, but not regularly, whereas television, even in very poor communities in Africa, happens all the time. So hypnosis strikes me as the word here, because children sit and gaze, but they don't engage. And it's very hard to make that difference on the screen, I think. It's a habit, and it's comforting. And if you're sad or hungry or depressed or just in a bad place, the television is like a kind of a drug for the senses. You can switch off and do nothing. I've done that when watching cricket, I can tell you.
Annette, let's bring Annette in on this.
Well, I think I want to revert to what I was saying about the difference between a passive regarding of the television and an active participant. And I think that when you're listening to a story in a group, you don't want the child to be diverted to other things going on in the room. The point I was making was that on the screen itself, you should have the child's eyes moving around the screen and not just fixated in the centre. So one is about being distracted, the other is about concentrating on what's going on and actually following it, so tracking with your eyes. I think what happens, why children become mesmerized, is that most of the things go on in the center of the screen. And that's, as Leslie was saying, a very negative way of just switching off from everything. But if you have to follow things, and Teletubbies and other programs made for children that are good actually capitalize on the child's ability to follow what's going on. They use a lot of repetition, for instance, which children love because they can then anticipate what's going to happen. So I think we need to analyse television in a rather different way.
I'm not saying for a moment that television's a bad thing. It's an entertainment, and particularly for people in difficult circumstances, it's an escape as well. It's not bad, but there's too much of it, and there's not enough of the other kind of storytelling, either through reading or listening to other people telling stories. And that's what we've done since we were first on this planet, is sit around and tell each other stories about what we did today, what happened when old so-and-so went over there and met old other person. It's our most, I think, most important human skill is telling stories. And we're losing it a bit because it's not encouraged, and neither is reading in some communities.
Leslie, you have the advantage of not just living in South Africa, but you've worked in other communities in Southern Africa, some of whom have a very different cultural background, more traditional. And I'm thinking particularly of your work with the San people in the Kalahari. I think you helped them actually set up their community website. So it's not just a traditional society, but one that's also connected to the internet, as you were saying. But I think you said that you found that their entire approach to themselves and their community seems very different. And I was wondering, in relation to what we're talking about with children and education, did you find their children very different from the sort of children that you come across in your life in South Africa?
Well, I was very privileged to go to the Kalahari in the late 80s when the culture was changing, and if I hadn't gone right then, I wouldn't have seen anything of it. It had already begun to change. And children were going to go to school now, everything was different, but it was a community effort to get those children to school and educated, with big arguments about how they'd get there on donkey carts and would lions come. I mean, this was really what was talked about. And we started 3 schools called Village Schools Project, which is part of a Harvard group anthropological outreach to the Kalahari. And we saw extraordinary development in children and young people. And I did that for a while on a part-time, volunteer basis mostly. And then I went back when some of those children had grown up and were able to start learning new communication skills. And when you go to a Kalahari village, you're always sitting on the ground, and around you is conversation going on and an enormous amount of laughing. I would say about equal. Unless something serious has happened, people are talking and laughing and exchanging the whole time. And I learned so much from that experience over 20 years, and particularly seeing this younger generation changing and adapting to a very impossible demands of first world culture in a very remote area.
So how did they have to change, the children?
Well, the needs and demands changed. The children didn't change. I think their basis of a good education in their own culture, to be in that culture, was what gives them some strength to go on. But their requirements, for example, in government education systems, they had to do certain things. They had to speak certain languages. They had to deliver certain goods to the education department. And that was incredibly hard for particularly such communal people who are not competitive. And I'm interested in some of the comments that Annette and Paul have made about good and right and moral and so on. And one of the things that came into that society was a loss of those traditional values. And it was very difficult for some young people to cope with the complete change from one culture to another. And most of what came from the Western civilization wasn't better than what they had before.
Because of loss of identity, is that what you're saying? Harder to make judgments?
Yes. I think if you rip people out of their traditional thinking and very abruptly make them fit into something totally different, for adults it's difficult, but for children it's extremely difficult. And I don't think that's been talked about very much, that the young children and now the young people have had a very rough ride. I call it the grinding edge, where they're on the edge of 2 generations of ways of life, and it's changed. And I think we can learn a lot from that, and in an educational and also in a communication sense.
Paul,
Yes.
Annette, the Kalahari Desert awaits you. Thanks to all three of you, Paul Bloom, Annette, Carmelov Smith and Leslie Beak. And I leave you not with birdsong this week, but meerkats, recorded in the Kalahari Desert in South Africa.
If you've enjoyed this BBC podcast, why not try others, such as In Our Time, where Melvin Bragg discusses the history of ideas. To find out more, visit bbc.com/podcast.
Syrian women have been briefing the Security Council ahead of talks scheduled to take place in Switzerland next week, aimed at finding a solution to the ongoing conflict in Syria. Ambassador Sylvie Lucas, the permanent representative of Luxembourg, a non-permanent member of the Council, told reporters that the women spoke about the challenges they face inside and outside Syria. She said they also engaged with Council members on how to ensure women's full and equal participation in the Syrian peace process.
And this is not only limited to the Geneva talks of next week, but beyond. Women perspectives need to be represented in conflict prevention, resolution, protection, and peace building. And women need to be fully and equally involved in peace negotiations. We strongly believe that an active participation of women in this process will help facilitate an inclusive, sustainable political settlement.
Ambassador Lucas says the Security Council was also reminded of the humanitarian tragedy in Syria and terrible price paid, in particular by women and children. Some 38,000 cases of sexual and gender-based violence were reported last year alone to United Nations and humanitarian agencies. Derek Mbata, United Nations.